Nikons are great for birds and wildlife. I'm going to quickly cover the bridge super zooms and then move on to used and new DSLR and mirrorless kits. These will range from $150 to $2,000. I'll explain the benefits and the potential cons of each option, along with some tips. The P-series super zooms have long been favorites because of, well, their absurd zoom range. To put it into perspective, the longest lens Nikon currently makes for the Z mount is the NIKKOR Z 600mm f4 TC VRS, which has a built-in 1.4x teleconverter, making it 850mm. Use that on a DX body and it's equivalent to a 1260mm lens on full frame. Keep in mind that the lens weighs 3,260 grams, which is over 7 pounds. The P900 has an equivalent zoom range of 24 to 2,000 millimeters. They can be found for around $500 used and only weigh 900 grams or about 2 pounds. With that amount of reach, you'll be able to be far enough away from birds not to need to wear camo or hide. Basically anything you can see, you'll be able to zoom into and get a photo of. It and the rest of the P series are excellent cameras for taking on a hike or going for a walk with. The one thing that I specifically don't like about the P900 is that it cannot shoot raw images, it only takes JPEGs. That's a major disadvantage if you want to do post-processing. And while you might not want to do that now, but keep in mind that storage is cheap. If you change your mind in the future, you don't want to regret not being able to go back and edit your images that you took in the past. The P950, P1000, and just released P1100 can all shoot RAW and have their zoom range increased to 3,000 millimeters. They also have bird and moon modes on the control dial. They optimize the camera settings for those specific types of photography. You won't have to worry about aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. The camera will do it all for you. If you want to buy new, the P1100 is a good option. However, it is a little expensive. An alternative that can be purchased new is the Panasonic FZ80D. In my opinion, the least expensive option is going to be about decade-old entry-level DSLRs. Paired with a telephoto lens, they will stomp a modern flagship phone in terms of image quality. No more trying to zoom in on a tiny speck. You're going to get images that you'll love. Starting around $150, you can find a Nikon D3100 with a 55 to 200 millimeter zoom lens. With that combo, you'll want to be close to your subject, around 3 meters for birds, and you can extrapolate from there for larger animals. I think they're great for backyard birds and other animals, but you're going to want to have some way to hide yourself. Remember, they don't want you to eat them. The D3200 and D3300 are each $50 more expensive than the previous generation. Those models see increases in resolution, video, and low light performance. I prefer them over the comparable Canon model, the T5i in the US and 700D everywhere other than Japan. My recommendation is to look for complete kits: camera, lens, battery, charger, and a memory card. I'd also recommend getting an 18 to 55 millimeter lens. That zoom range covers general photography needs. It was the kit lens, so it is the most common lens to see included with those cameras. When you go shopping, only buy clean looking cameras. You don't want it to be dusty, sandy, or see any signs of corrosion, which would be bluish or whitish, crystallish looking stuff on the bottom of the camera around the screw holes. 50,000 is the highest shutter count I would buy. Anything under that and you'll be fine. If you decide you want to upgrade in the future, you'll most likely be able to sell these and get most, if not all, of your money back. That's why they're a good choice to learn photography with. Which shutter speed, aperture, and ISO? What settings do you need for birds? In general, you're going to want to keep your shutter speed high and around 1/2000th of a second or faster if you want to catch birds in flight, and that will counteract lens movement as well as the movement of birds. Thankfully, there's tons of educational content on these models. You can find websites, forums, books, or videos, which will provide a good learning experience. The advantage over the bridge super zooms is that the lenses are interchangeable. That allows you to upgrade the camera body or lens separately. For example, a better but more expensive lens than the 55-200mm is a 70-300. You'll be less likely to startle your subject because you'll be able to be farther away. Or from the same distance, your subject will fill more of the frame. The next meaningful upgrade in terms of a camera body would be the Nikon D5200. It's the first in the 5000 series to get an upgrade to the 39 autofocus point system. That's compared to the 11 autofocus points found in the earlier models in the series and all of the 3000 series cameras. Later models in the 5000 series do not see an increase in the number of autofocus points. Those 39 autofocus points cover more of the frame, which will make it easier to track moving subjects. That, combined with the increase in frames per second, is going to make it possible to start getting good images of birds in flight. The hit rate's not going to be very high, and it's going to be pretty demanding in terms of skill. The front-facing flippy screen is a nice feature. The camera allows you to shoot 1080p 30 video, which is perfect for talking head videos, similar to the one I'm shooting right now. All that, you might be able to find a body for $150, or preferably with the 55-300mm kit zoom for around $300. The D5300 sees a bump to 1080p 60 video, but for wildlife that doesn't matter. You're not going to get usable footage without stabilizing the camera. The next step up in performance gets us into the prosumer lineup with the D7100. I like to think of the 7000 series as wedding photographer cameras. They're going to be capable of everything. The D7100 was the first in the lineup to get an upgrade to 51 autofocus points. 6 frames per second continuous shooting is going to be fun. Both of those things are going to make it easier to track moving subjects. They can be found for around $350, and for that price, I know I would be excited to find one in good condition. The D7200 sees actual improvements for an additional $100. A good lens to keep the total kit cost under $1,000 would be the $400-ish Nikon AF NIKKOR 80-400mm f4.5-5.6D ED-VR. The D indicates that the lens is built for a camera with a built-in autofocus motor to power the autofocus of the lens. The entire 7000 series has built-in autofocus motors. The D5200 and all of the D3000 series do not. So while you could use the lens on those cameras, you will not be able to use autofocus, so I would not recommend doing it. The Tamron SP 200-500 f5-6.3 is another option that needs a screw drive motor, a built-in motor for autofocus, but you're going to have to hunt to find them in good condition. A downside to both of the lenses is they cannot be adapted with autofocus to a Z-mount camera like the Z50. There are 4 lenses that I think make up the mid-tier of wildlife zooms. They go from $600 to $800 used depending on their condition, which is probably going to put you over $1,000 with something like a D7100. But keep in mind the 1.5x crop factor, which gives you greater equivalent reach, as I'm going to be talking about some of the full frame cameras soon. The Nikon 200-500 f5.6e is an incredible lens. Considering the performance, it's shocking how inexpensive it is. While not light, it can be handheld for short periods of time. It's also relatively compact. Unfortunately, it marks a point where you can no longer blame the gear. If you can't track your subject, that's going to be on you. The Tamron 150-600 f5 to 6.3 G2 used to be cheaper than the Nikon, but it seems like prices on all of these lenses have kind of muddled together where they're all pretty similar, and the defining factor is going to be the condition of the lens. I would recommend avoiding any of the previous non-G2 versions of the lens. In the last 10 years, Tamron has greatly improved the quality of the lenses they make, and that can be seen in their G2 lineup. Then there is the Sigma 150-600 f5 to 6.3 as either a sport or contemporary model. The sport has the better build quality. The contemporary is 910 grams, or about 2 pounds lighter than the sport. It was also originally cheaper. And you're going to want to watch out for what lens mount the lenses have, as they were sold with several. The Z50 is a good mirrorless option, as you can start to find them for around $500 used. If you can't find it bundled with the camera, a 50-250 f4.5 to 6.3 is around $200 used. That's about the same price as one of the FTZ adapters that will allow you to use the F-mount lenses on the mirrorless cameras. However, there are several problems with the camera. The first being that the screen flips down to face forward, which is great unless you want to use a tripod. I don't understand the decision behind that. The 5 frames per second of the mechanical shutter is the worst at this price point. The readout speed of the electronic shutter is about 1/40th of a second. If your subject is fast enough, you're going to see rolling shutter. The thing that kills my interest with the Z50 is that it doesn't have USB-C. I despise micro USB almost as much as the planned obsolescence that went behind that decision. The Z52 has a usable front-facing camera and USB-C. It's a budget killer, but you do get tangible benefits. The autofocus is improved and it can shoot 11 frames per second, which is the same as the 4DS. However, there's a gap when it comes to Nikon Z-mount telephoto zooms. The next cheapest lens after the 50-250 is the NIKKOR Z 180-600 f5.6 to 6.3 VR, being sold for a very reasonable $1,900 new. Even if you buy used, a kit is going to end up being well over $2,000. A cheaper option is the Tamron 150-500 f5 to 6.7 Di3 VC VXD. That last part, of course, standing for Voice Coil Extreme Torque Drive, which is just a fancy name for a linear motor. It might be possible to find one used along with a used Z52 and come in under $2,000. Another option would be to adapt the 200-500, but it would be cheaper to use that on a DSLR. There are a couple of mirrorless full-frame cameras starting around $700 with the Z6. It was one of the launch bodies for the Z-mount. When it was launched, many people had complaints about the continuous autofocus. There have been several firmware updates that have improved it. It is impressive that it has 273 autofocus points covering 90% of the frame. It can shoot 12 frames per second and has a huge buffer thanks to the CF Express cards that it uses. The Z6 II uses the same sensor. The processing power has been beefed up, which should improve autofocus speed. It can shoot 14 frames per second and record 4K 60 video. For hybrid use, the professional DSLRs I'm going to talk about soon should not even be considered. For general use, it would be great to get with the kit 24-70 f4. It's definitely a good hybrid camera, but I don't see how you end up with a wildlife kit under $2,000. The Z7 is the last mirrorless camera in the video. It was the second higher end launch camera. The 45 megapixel sensor has a relatively slow readout speed that should be expected as it's reading out twice the amount of data as the Z6. The result is rolling shutter, making it a bad choice for video. Consider the $1,100-ish price. It can only shoot 5.5 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, and you can see why I wouldn't recommend it for wildlife. It's much better suited for portraits, landscapes, architecture, or product photography. All of the full frame cameras are good, but the one I'm going to recommend to begin with is the D750. We're really lucky to be able to get a camera as good as it for less than $600. I had one and it was great apart from two things. First, the eye cup loves to pop off and go on adventures. Second, there was a recall that had to do with the mirror box. You can check the serial number to see if a body was affected. If they've already been repaired, there will be a black dot on the bottom of the tripod socket. The repair window has closed, so if it hasn't been repaired, it never will be. I think the D750 would be a good choice if you also want to do other types of photography like landscapes or portraits. That's where having a full frame sensor can be an advantage. For hybrid or video use, you're going to be much better off with a mirrorless camera. If wildlife is your priority, I think the D7500 is a better choice. Nikon is still selling them new for $700. It can shoot 8 frames per second compared to the 6.5 on the D750. Plus you get the free crop of the APS-C sensor, giving you more reach. Compared to the D7200, it has a new sensor, which makes it better at low light. The image buffer was almost tripled in size compared to the D7200. You can do a lot more continuous shooting compared to the previous cameras I have mentioned in this video. It's the second best APS-C DX DSLR you can get for wildlife. The D500 is clearly the best APS-C DSLR. They can be found for less than $900. I'm surprised at how many with low shutter counts are still around. It has 153 autofocus points and can shoot 10 frames per second with an enormous buffer. It was designed to shoot things in flight. The previously mentioned 200 to 500 is a very popular lens to use with the camera. They were released around the same time. Keep in mind that the D500 uses XQD memory cards. CF Express cards can be used with the latest firmware. This was the camera I was thinking about when I set the upper limit for the price ranges I was going to cover. If we go back to full frame, there is the D780. It's much better at video than the D750 and is probably the best full frame DSLR for video. Though a Nikon DSLR would never be my first choice for video. You can still buy them new from Nikon for $1,400. Photographers are still using it professionally. I don't think there is anything bad to say about the camera. However, unless you have a preference for an optical viewfinder, I think I would go with a Z6 II. If you want a flagship DSLR body, the D4S is probably the best choice. Though, unless you have very large hands, I don't think it would be a good choice for a first camera. It's big and heavy. You're likely going to need some way to support the camera and lens, and whatever solution you come up with is going to be expensive due to how much weight it is going to need to be able to hold. So that means you're probably a large tripod, and large lens is going to need a specialty bag that is also going to be large and expensive. The implied expectation of the camera is that you're probably going to be hiding somewhere, laying in wait for your subject to show up. That's what makes it such a big commitment if you're just looking to try out wildlife photography. As a fair weather photographer, I think I would rather have the P1100. Of course, there are more expensive cameras and lenses and options from other manufacturers. So if you want even more options, watch some of my other videos. Otherwise, thank you for watching and please subscribe.